Let me tell you a little about myself. I was born in the borough of Brooklyn. I was educated on Long Island. Harlem is my home, this is where I learned love for family and appreciation for community. I have confronted the prejudice of race and challenged the issues of my own disability. I have served in government for over 2 decades. I stand willing and able to lead this state to a brighter future and a better tomorrow. Let me reintroduce myself. I am David Paterson, and I am the governor of New York State.
Hey, good morning and welcome to another edition of The Morning Stretch. I'm your host, Tony Herbert, and we are here on 125th Street and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, the heart of Harlem, USA, just blocks from the historic Apollo Theater and across the street from the famed Hotel Teresa, one of the greatest landmarks in New York City history. We're here in Harlem to speak with Governor David Paterson about what he's been up to and what his feels are about what's happening in politics today. Come join me. Let's have that conversation. Governor, it's an honor to have the opportunity to sit here and talk with you again. I think the last time we talked was just after 9/11. We were downtown in Manhattan. You had just taken over as the Democratic caucus chair of the Senate, if I remember, if I'm not mistaken. And we did have an opportunity to have a discussion, and I'm honored to do this again.
You know, one of the things that happened right after September 11th that is, in retrospect, quite interesting, is that I held a press conference not 1 month later, but one day before it,
right.
October 10th, 2011. And the press conference was about the fact that we believed that it was unsafe for New Yorkers to live or work in the catchment area of the explosion that brought down the 2 towers. And we got such a negative reaction that only a few outlets of the media covered it. And we couldn't even do the press conference near the area. We had to do it in Bryant Park. And we pointed out that there were toxins in the air. There was the fires were still burning at that time.
Right.
The fires didn't go out until January of 2002. And now, look at what's happened. The recoveries that people who lived and worked there were able to make in the court system, and then some couldn't recover from the diseases and injuries that they received from that day.
Yeah, I was looking back at that, and I said, I'm getting the opportunity to talk to you again. And we all dealt and walked through that at that time. Let's talk a little bit about this. Now, you know, from a historical standpoint, your dad, Basil Paterson, and what have you, one whom we all celebrate, you know, quite frankly, for all his professionalism. He was one of the biggest political figures in the city of New York. What was the manifestation of you doing exactly what he did, becoming a politician? What led you to that? Was he an influence?
He certainly was an influence, and I think he was an influence, but the exposure was an influence. And I remember that on Channel 13, which was just become public broadcast, he appeared on television the night that Dr. Martin Luther King was slain, obviously April 4th, 2008. And Bayard Rustin and I remember some of the other people on the show, and they were all looking at King in a historic sense. And when it got to my father's turn, he said he's angry about King being assassinated. And that was a feeling that many of us had, that it was too early to take this, you know, put this in perspective only 3 or 4 hours after he'd been slain. And I remember that there was a real, competition, if you would be, that people could get into the Ebenezer Baptist Church and be part of the funeral. In other words, they would seen Dr. King's funeral. My father instead flew to Memphis and marched with the sanitation workers, which is where King would have been had he survived. So this unique perspective that he had, and his interest in history, and his interest in community, and his interest in trying to even opportunities for black people who did not come in here as looking for a new beginning. They were, for the most part, coming here after avoiding a terrible end, as 2/3 of their brothers and sisters did on the way over here.
Mm-hmm.
So he was certainly an influence, but I think what also was an influence is that I got to see meetings of the Council of Elected Negro Democrats. I used to go and sit there when I was 12 years old. Half the time I had no idea what they were talking about. And yet, sometimes it's not exactly what a parent does for you, it's what they instill in you by your exposure, and somehow it helped me as I developed the plans for my life.
Awesome. Now he was considered a part of what they call the Gang of Four: Percy Sutton, Charlie Rangel, your father, and David Dinkins. What was that like, being around that much of influence in politics here in New York?
What's very interesting, I did an interview just like this, in which I was doing the interviewing.
Oh, okay.
And I was interviewing Congressman Charles Rangel and Mayor David Dinkins. And I raised an issue with them, and they agreed to this, that the Gang of Four, the expression, was not one of endearment. It was very negative, and it was offered by the former borough president of the Bronx and former congressman, the late Herman Badillo,
Okay.
in March of 1985, when the Coalition for Just New York nominated Denny Farrell to run for mayor. And Badillo said it was put together by a gang of four, meaning Basil Patterson, David Dinkins, Charles Rangel, and Denny Farrell. That was who he was referring to. But because Percy Sutton was at Inner City Broadcasting and was barred from political activity, he wasn't as involved in these types of meetings and didn't endorse candidates. And he was very politically involved, but there's certain things he couldn't do. But the relationship that four had, over that time, the Gang of Four went from a negative to a positive, and it was bestowed on Sutton along with the other three.
Now you're considered, basically one of the most inspirational figures in our city. I mean, with all due respect, not only being the first black governor, but at the same time, in our state's history, and being legally blind. I guess my question is, where did you get the strength to actually navigate through this craziness, and with a slight handicap, if you want to call it that?
Well, I was not only the first black governor, but it's my belief that I will be the last black governor of New York. But I would say that I think that I had a perspective about the world that was a little different than many African Americans, because living in an African American neighborhood, I was discriminated against roundly because of my disability, and it was coming from other black people. In fact, a person who had a pretty good position in our local NAACP was hiring young people to work in a catering service after my sophomore year of college, and he invited a friend of mine and me to round up 15 young people to work in the catering service. Well, we gave him 13 names plus the 2 of ours, and he hired 14 of the people and left me off the list. And I was so chagrined at being turned down for that position that I went back to college at Columbia University and basically flunked out. I didn't show up for any exams and could really have lost my whole career right then. I got some encouragement from a few people who told me to go out and find a job, which would satisfy my belief at the time that why should I stay in the educational system if I can't work when I get out of it? And ironically, blind people's performance educationally is 3% higher than the national average, but 71% of blind people are unemployed. So it was kind of a blessing that I was able to get to this position with this disability. If you read articles about me when I became governor, everything written about me before was always very salutatory and complimentary. But when I became governor, the idea that somebody with this visual deficiency is in charge created, Saturday Night Live cartoon-like expositions of me.
Here's the skit, and it featured Fred Armisen playing sort of a stumbling, confused Governor David Paterson. They were obviously poking fun at the fact that he, does have limited vision. Well, the governor, understandably so, is releasing his own comments with regard to this SNL skit. Let's take a listen.
Well, I appreciate a sense of humor everywhere, and even from Saturday Night Live. Now that Governor Palin's not around, they seem to have run out of material. And I don't mind that they make fun of me, but I thought it was important that I speak up for those who don't have a voice and don't have a job.
The New York Post, I said something like at a press conference, we will be building at the World Trade Center. And we'd started some of the construction, but I was talking about the real building. And the Post wrote, well, maybe they should take him down there so he can touch the buildings since he can't see them, which was a nasty thing to write.
Crazy.
And many other things. And then also I found that I got referred to as the accidental governor because it was an accident that a black person became governor. I became governor the same way a man named Malcolm Wilson did when Governor Rockefeller resigned in 1974. He became the governor. What's an accident about that? The Constitution provides for it. That's why they have a position called lieutenant governor. So, I recognize that the people, for the most part, were with me, but the media still relishes in the derision of people, in the stereotyping of African Americans. It was always just this kind of notion that I wasn't serious about the job. I'd rather be at a party or hanging out or something like that. It was a very bitter pill to take, but what I would say in retrospect is we have minority and women's business enterprises. We quadrupled the participation in my administration. We created a new allowance for welfare, people who unfortunately have to collect welfare. It was the first time that had been done in 20 years. We stopped the procedure of stop, frisk, and then hold the records. If a person isn't doing anything wrong, why are we keeping records of them? Because we presume they're doing something wrong. And we put a stop to that. And we straightened out the issue of not enough black men and women and also Hispanic men and women on our Supreme Court, our Appellate Division, and Court of Appeals. So I think that for all that could be accomplished in the time I was there, if there had to be a few hits taken for it, I accept it with honor.
Well, I mean, you've had a storied career. You started out as a senator, correct? If I'm not mistaken, that's your first job in politics?
I started out as a child.
Okay.
And I was very interesting that you would bring that up. And I think it's something that I hope everyone who's watching this, and even those of us in the room who are working on it, think about that coincidence. There's something about coincidence. The more you pay attention to them, the more interesting life is. So I had a coincidence in my life. The first part of it was that I missed passing New York State's bar exam by a few points, and I was agitated because I didn't think I was given enough time, since it takes me longer to complete the exam. So I quit the Queens DA's office where I'm working, and I come back to work for the 1985 election campaign of David Dinkins, who's running for borough president. One night, there is a candidates night, and Dinkins decides the people there don't like him and he doesn't like them, so he's not going. And the person who usually took his place, his surrogate, well, he didn't like the people either. He said he wasn't going. So somebody said, well, somebody has to go. I was the fundraiser. So they said, you go. I said, well, I do fundraising. And they gave me some position papers to read, and I go up there, and Mr. Herbert, they beat the you-know-what out of me from 7 o'clock in the evening till nearly 8:30, maybe even later than that.
Wow.
And everything I said as far as they was concerned was wrong, and everything point I tried to make got contradicted from the audience. And finally, the head of the club, who was an old district leader named Alan Hodge, who's was most remembered for being convicted of stealing cheese from a poverty program. But anyway, so they called him the cheese thief. So the cheese thief ended the meeting, and he said, look, please don't take this personally. The reality is, you and I both know that we wanted to hear from Mr. Dinkins. He's running for borough president, and you let him know that the next time that we ask a candidate to come someplace, he better be there. So I said, yes, sir, I'll tell him that. And then this woman raises her hand. She's like in the third row. She'd beaten up on me 3 times in that meeting. And she says, well, I have one more question. I'm like, oh, no. Like, I'm already dead. What are we going to do now, burn the body? And she says, first of all, I want you to tell you I'm not voting for your candidate. He didn't come here, I'm not voting for him. I said, that's your prerogative, ma'am. And she said to me, and I think this changed my life, she said, but you know something? I really admire how you sat there for the last hour and a half and took this from us. You knew we were insulting you, and yet you graciously answered all our questions. Tell me when you run for something, because I'm with you. And she clapped, and everybody in the room stood up and clapped for me. Now, all I had to do was to try to keep from crying.
Wow.
And 3 weeks later, the senator passed away. A couple of days later, after that, Percy Sutton said to me, run for the office. I said, I have to finish taking the bar exam. And he said in that accent that might be from San Antonio, it might be from the islands, or it might be from New York. Nobody knew why he talked that way. He said, young man, by the time you complete the bar exam, the position will no longer be available. I was like, okay, I'm running for the state senate. And I was able to win. And I sat with Percy Sutton at lunch to thank him. And I said to him, why would you pick me? And he said, the reason that I picked you was because I heard about this performance that you gave in this political club. So think of all the ways, if I'd passed the bar exam, if Dinkins' surrogate went to the club, if Dinkins went to the club, if I decided I wasn't going to go, think of all the things that could have canceled that appointment that I had with fate. But I guess that spirit above is guiding all of it.
Got it, got it. So I heard you mention you worked in the Queens DA, then became the senator. All of a sudden now, you're the governor of the state of New York. What were your thoughts when Spitzer resigned? How did that come about? How did you hear about it? And what were your thoughts immediately after that? Because you were catapulted right there.
So March 10th, 2008, which is a Monday, I'm in my office, and I'm lieutenant governor. And they called me up and they said, there's a family planning event at 11:30 down in the Capitol, and the governor's not here. Could you please go? Lieutenant governors are so inconsequential, they didn't even know I was invited as well. So I already have some remarks I'm going to make. But I said to them, well, you know, I'm kind of busy over here. Lieutenant governor's never busy. And I said, but I'll go down there. I'll do it for you. So I go down, I make the remarks, and then about 12:30 they call back and they said, listen, the cardinal is coming at 1:30 with all the bishops in the Catholic Church to see the governor. The governor is still delayed. We need you to do that meeting. And I said to them, I'm not doing that meeting. And when they asked me why, I said, because that's head of state to head of state. You know, and I said to them, that would be as if the Queen of England came to visit President Bush and he's busy, so he sends Cheney. I said, now in that case, maybe that would be a good substitution because Cheney was running the government anyway. But I said, I'm not doing it. So even my chief of staff, a former priest, said to me, come on, they gave it to you, take it. I said, I'm not doing it. And is everybody here going crazy? Well, they weren't going crazy. They knew the governor was going to resign at 2:15. They knew that I didn't know it, and no one bothered to tell me because the governor said he'd tell me himself, but he didn't. So he comes out at 2:15. Now, I'm thinking that I'm going to be governor in 5 minutes, and I have a few notes, which will later be known as an inauguration speech. They told me at 1:05 about these problems. I was absolutely shocked, Tony. I was absolutely shocked. And so what saved me was that the governor's wife forbid him to resign at that point. And they needed to give her a couple of days to see that it was the only way. If he didn't resign, he'd probably be impeached. And so what was going through my mind was that we had an economic crisis that was starting in the country. And now we had a leadership crisis in New York State. And it was March 17th. That's the day I was sworn in. If I could pass that budget in 2 weeks, when budgets had been late 23 out of the last 26 years, that would be a statement that someone's in charge. Now, I wasn't exactly able to do that, but I came close enough that I think it restored confidence in New Yorkers that a manager was at the helm who could run the state.
Awesome. I mean, one of the things that we celebrated was the speech that you gave. I mean, it was memorable. And when you were sworn in, that speech actually still resonates to a lot of folks because it was that powerful. Actually, I want to listen to it right now.
Of course, I never expected to have the honor of serving as governor of New York State, but our Constitution demands it. This transition today is an historic message to the world that we live among the same values that we profess and that we are a government of laws and not individuals.
What went into that speech?
I don't know how I gave that speech. The night before, when I was trying to practice the speech, my daughter, who had come back from vacation in Aruba, had to go to the hospital. I'm walking up and down the halls trying to remember the speech. Then in the morning, we got word that the government had saved Bear Stearns, so we had to address it that day. That was the news of the day. So they put 2 paragraphs in the speech for me to memorize, and I haven't even gotten the rest of the speech memorized. And then around 11 o'clock, I came down with this really massive headache, so I couldn't do anything for an hour. And I even got Mayor Bloomberg to sit in my office and pretend he was meeting with me while I was resting, because I knew no one would open the door while he was in there. And there were 28 people in the room that I had to recognize before I spoke, and I actually got them in order, which shocked me. And it certainly was well received, maybe partly because of how good the speech was and partly because the previous governor had resigned.
Now, you said that you didn't run for governor, for the most part, and was that one of your goals, or was it just totally that did you even imagine that you would be governor?
When Governor Spitzer approached me about running for governor, it was generally believed that the Democrats could take over the Senate now, because I won 3 seats as the minority leader in 2004, 1 more in 2006, and 1 in early 2007, so we're only 2 seats away if I had stayed there. And now the governor's in our court, and this is the first governor that said he's going to help the Senate Democrats. And I would have become the first majority leader who was black in the state of New York. And that's the second most powerful position to the governor.
Right.
And many questioned and cajoled and criticized the fact that I gave it up to be lieutenant governor, whose sole purpose is really to call the governor in the morning, and if he answers, your work is done for the day. So I think that my my orientation was more legislative. I was an advocate. I was a persuader. I was, well, you know, in the bill, maybe you could put in something about, you know, more opportunities for men and women owned businesses who happen to be black or Hispanic or Asian or women. So transferring to becoming the executive was difficult for me. And they also say that governors and presidents need a year to learn how to be one. So, you know, I had the added problem that, you know, there was no campaign, there was no transition team, there was just myself, and also that 10 to 12 of Spitzer's top people resigned immediately. They were so shocked and basically paralyzed by Spitzer leaving, even though a couple of them came back later because they really enjoyed government service and they worked well with me. So I think that when I accepted the invitation to run for lieutenant governor, my theory was that Hillary Clinton would be the president, that she would win the 2008 presidential election. The governor would appoint a U.S. senator. If he appoints anyone other than me, then 10 other people get mad at him. But if he appoints me, everybody will say, well, we're not happy, but that's his guy, so he put him there. So that was my aim, to replace Hillary Clinton as the U.S. senator.
Got it. We'll be right back with Governor David Paterson.
Then let us seize that poignant moment. Let us right here and now, let us grab the unusual opportunities that circumstance has handed us today and put personal politics, party advantage, and power struggles aside in favor of service in the interest of the people.
We're back with Governor David Paterson. Now, as with David Dinkins, where Rudy Giuliani attempted to take credit for some of the Dinkins achievements as New York City's first African-American mayor, and with Donald Trump wanting to take credit for all of what President Obama has done and all his great accomplishments, restoring or growing our economy, which I think he's destroying, but in an attempt to marginalize their accomplishments as first African-Americans, do you think this happened to you when you became governor?
Well, mine was a friendlier transition. It was to Governor Andrew Cuomo, who I'd worked on some of these issues with. When I was lieutenant governor and he was attorney general, and even when I was minority leader of the Senate, and he was a big advocate for overturning the Rockefeller drug laws. So I was able to overturn the Rockefeller drug laws myself as governor in 2009, but I wasn't able to pass same-sex marriage as I tried feverishly to do, and he passed it 6 months later. We got the MWB numbers up to about 14%. His administration gave us credit for 10 and said now they're going to 30%, but what I think, I went up to an MWBE conference last year, and I saw the exact same people there that when I left 7 years ago. So what I think, and what I hope the governor does, because I think he's very committed to this, is to not count the 30% of contracts, but count the 30% of the value of the contracts, which would be empowering if minorities and women played a greater role. But it doesn't bother me to the extent that it would with Mayor Dinkins or with President Obama, because Governor Cuomo gives me credit for what I did while I was there. And he opened his inauguration speech in 2011 when he became the governor by saying that if I hadn't made the cuts and raised the taxes that I did, that New York would be in a real bad situation.
To a man who governed this state at what will go down as one of the most difficult periods of time in the history of this state. I believe that he became captain of the ship just when the ship was heading into a storm, and he warned us about the storm, and he brought us through the storm. He's done 25 years of public service. He's a personal friend of mine, and to many people in this room, let's give a big round of applause to Governor David Paterson. Thank you, Governor David Paterson.
And really, he had to close one more tough budget in 2011, and then he's had, pretty clear sailing since then. But he asked me to be chair of the state party. He asked me to serve on the MTA board. He's invited me up to be honored at times. So it never really, feels that way. And
Great.
He really made some wonderful remarks when they posted my portrait in the Capitol. We'll stay there as long as the Capitol's there.
Right.
In 2014.
What would you say are some of the most important points or things that you've done as governor?
Well, I think it was a 40-year fight to try to rid ourselves of imperiling a whole generation of the Rockefeller drug laws. At one point, we had 78,000 prisoners in different facilities in New York State. And that was 6 times the amount that were there in 1970 when he implemented the drug laws. I think it was important to redistribute procurement from the state in the minority and women-owned businesses. Also, the Article 15A did not cover banking, insurance, or the sales of securities and bonds. And we made some great strides to get black-owned investment banks involved in municipal financing and other areas. I think that was quite important. We set up an immigration pardon panel, which probably today, looking back on it, whereby the ICE, the INS, were about to basically deport people who had very small infractions. A Peruvian woman who passed a bad check when she was 19, they finally got around to noticing that she was convicted of a misdemeanor. We're going to deport her at 58 years old. And I pardoned her. That eliminated the crime, so it eliminated the need for a pardon. There was an African-American man who shot an intruder in his apartment. He wasn't even tried by the district attorney's office. They saw it as him protecting his home. The government was going to deport him, and I stopped it with a pardon. And there were many cases like this. I think that I've noticed since I've done it that President Obama, who didn't pardon anyone for a couple of years, did a lot of actions very similarly, and now Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York has followed suit. But it took, usually there'd be 2 or 3 pardons a year, and they were so needed that no one had complained about them. I did 45, and there were a lot of complaints about him, but not one of them to this point has ever committed another crime.
Interesting. Hillary Clinton went to join the Obama administration and his cabinet, and it turned around and left that vacancy in the Senate. You now had the authority to appoint her replacement. You chose Kirsten Gillibrand. How did you come to that decision?
Well, many people always say to me, why didn't you choose yourself? You said you would like to take Hillary Clinton's place. And in a different circumstance, I might have, but I did some research. 9 of the last 10 governors who appointed themselves to the Senate were defeated in their first campaign.
Wow.
The only one who survived was the old baseball commissioner, Happy Chandler, in Kentucky.
Wow.
So, seeing that wasn't a good idea, even if I thought I could be the exception, like Happy Chandler, the Senate, the New York State Senate, whose leader, the majority leader, is next in line after the lieutenant governor, and there was no lieutenant governor because I had moved up to governor, to take the governor's place. The majority leader cannot be governor, they can be acting governor. And there were 32 Democrats giving them the majority in the Senate, and 30 Republicans. So they only needed 2 people to switch, and there were 4 senators that were threatening to switch even when the Majority Leader Malcolm Smith was put in place in 2009. They were Pedro Espada, Hiram Montserrat, Ruben Diaz Sr., and Carl Kruger. I think they called themselves the 4 Amigos. Well, later on they could have called themselves the 4 Inmates, because with the exception of Ruben Diaz Jr., all of them wound up going to prison for corruption. And I was afraid that if I appointed myself to the Senate, that the fight over who was going to be the majority leader would be dwarfed times 10 by the fight over who would become the acting governor. And even in, if you remember that Senate situation, they gave Pedro Espada the position of majority leader to get him to switch, promoting him over probably 25 to 30 Republicans, just to be in the majority. So I decided to stay. Once I decided to stay, I think that I allowed a lot of activity to go on around me that I should have stopped. People, the former chief of staff to Mayor Bloomberg, writing an op-ed article in the Daily News in 2009 that if the governor doesn't appoint Caroline Kennedy, it's political malpractice. Political malpractice. She never had a public office in her life. Why does the first one have to be U.S. Senator? The sort of Kennedy-Cuomo rivalry that was, you know, where they were kind of attacking each other during that particular time. I think it would have been better if I said the next time I hear any public pronouncement about who I should take, that person's immediately eliminated from the list.
Wow.
That's what I think I should have done to stop this. And it became very much a circus. But Kirsten Gillibrand was the youngest senator. She was a woman, as was Hillary Clinton. She understood finance more than any of the other candidates, I thought, maybe with the exception of the Attorney General, Andrew Cuomo. And she was, would become the youngest United States senator. And this was in a year that the public had elected Barack Obama, when young people, 18 to 21, voted for the first time since they were given that right in 1972. So I thought, the fact that she was from upstate, that hadn't had a senator in 40 years, that I could check the boxes for a lot of streaks of denial of opportunity to so many different areas. And not only could I check those boxes, but I could check it with someone who probably was in the top 3 just based on skill by itself.
But she hailed from a Republican district, so was there any pushback from the White House with regards to appointing her in that seat? Was there some concern?
No, they were very happy about her.
Okay.
And the president's chief of staff at the White House, Ron, and I'm not thinking of his last name, but he was a big fan of hers, so he was very happy about that.
Now, you mentioned Caroline Kennedy, and she was like the media's darling because she was from Camelot,
right?
Quite frankly, all the major newspapers, and I'm looking at some of the articles, seem to want Kennedy back in D.C. What impact did your decision come about to not appoint Caroline?
Well, Caroline, I thought, was a very hard worker, a very would have made a very good senator, but I also thought that she was responsible for a lot of the circus activity, because every time these things would happen, I'd tell her, you better tell your people to calm down, and she couldn't seem to do that, and that bothered me.
Right.
Eventually she took herself out of the race for an unknown reason, and though she told me she wanted to do that, she then went and did it without telling me, so it was all just as well. That, that kind of erratic conduct, I didn't think suited the person who would take this seat.
Now, has Kirsten lived up to your expectations with regards to her, having me in the seat right now?
Well, she certainly has the courage. She certainly has the ability. She certainly, particularly in her work about the sexual abuse against women in the military, she has the guile to to do this kind of work. She's being mentioned as a possible presidential or vice presidential candidate. And I noticed they don't mention that she was appointed by Governor Patterson, where when she first came in and they criticized her for changing different positions she had, they always mentioned she came from Governor Patterson.
Right.
So I take her success as a compliment.
Oh, and I was going to ask you that, with all the hits that you got from media making that appointment, and now her looking at possibly a potential 2020 presidential candidate, do you feel some kind of indication from there?
No, absolutely.
And hey, I mean, she's actually facing re-election at this time, correct? Is that what's coming up?
She is facing re-election. I don't think this will be one of the great battles of the century. I'll put it that way.
Now, there were, some would think that, they were targeting you because you were the first black governor, and that folks were just throwing things out there just to see what would stick. Do you feel that being dogged by scandals, for the most part, that probably never even really existed, do you think all of these, they were just sort of kind of blown out of proportion?
I think that the amount of cuts that I made to some major areas, healthcare and education and the like, which I regret deeply, but it was only a way to keep the state from going into default, perhaps, triggered this reaction. And I think the media's treatment of me ignited a belief in other elected officials and advocates that they could say anything about me and get away with it. Sometimes I think the treatment was kind of cruel, and the scandals were completely ridiculous, particularly in light of what the scandals are about now. And the people, I mean, they've now convicted in basically 1 week the former speaker, the former majority leader, and the head of New York's tech program of some significant violations, with the exception of the head of the tech program, involving real corruption and the taking of money, and the abuse of power. I said to someone after that, my Yankees tickets are looking pretty good. So the governor went to a Yankee game and didn't buy the tickets because it was the first game of the World Series and it was an event. The majority of people in the audience were from the same state. So it's like going to any event like that. And 3 councils, one that was Spitzer's council that was with me for a while, and 2 that served under me, all agreed that that was permissible. And when the Public Integrity Committee fined me the amount of money that they did, the next year the legislature changed the legislation to exactly the interpretation that my councils had offered about the previous legislation. So they didn't give me my money back, but there was vindication there. And then there were other, scandals that, I wish, I'll give this to President Trump, I wish he had used the term fake news during that particular time, because I know he's upset about a few things. He hasn't seen fake news. We'll talk one day and he'll find out what fake news is. And there's one thing on the internet that's fake news, that he was accused of asking a significant other, domestic violence victim of a staff member, not to press charges. First of all, that's not even what I was accused of. I was accused of asking them not to get an order of protection. Who would tell someone not to get an order of protection if they were afraid of someone?
Exactly.
There's no record, the person isn't going to lose their job because someone took out an order of protection against them. But secondly, there was never an accuser. And you can see this if you look my name up on Wikipedia. But the woman who's the only one that could have accused me said that it didn't happen. The woman who was with her when we had the phone conversation said that I never said it, and her lawyer said I never said it. So a lot of people made that kind of like, that's the case, he needs to resign, even including Senator Gillibrand. But in the Me Too cases, there's always been an accuser. There was no accuser here. Now, there's a difference between an accuser and a rumor. And to ask someone to resign over a rumor, I think is highly unprofessional and inappropriate.
Totally. Now, it was, and we can clear this up too. It was reported that the Democratic Party didn't back you for your re-election bid. In fact, it was reported that President Obama supposedly or allegedly the first black president in U.S. history, didn't support your reelection bid. Is there some truth to that, or is that just more fake news?
I think that is largely true. I think that President Obama's political team were made up of individuals who were very supportive of the Attorney General candidacy of Andrew Cuomo and wanted him to run for governor in 2002. And I think that we were having a hard time in New York. And President Obama said to me that he was sickened by the process, but we were supposed to have a conversation about what that meant later on that we never had. And you know, President Obama enjoyed a privilege that I don't think very many elected officials had, which is that all of us were so proud. I'm sure you never thought you would see a black president in your lifetime.
Right.
And the fact that we did, there was no filter. We defended him down the line. Whatever he did, we supported him. However, one of the demerits of his administration was the only African American who ever had trouble that I ever saw President Obama support was Louis Gates.
Professor Gates is already in his house. The police officer comes in. I'm sure there's some exchange of words, but my understanding is that Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct, charges which are later dropped. Now, I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately.
His friend from Harvard.
Right.
But when Congressman Rangel was brought up on charges in the House, he said he's too old and needs to retire. He basically gave the wink that I shouldn't be running for re-election. And there was even the woman who was accused of making remarks in a speech in Mississippi, Shirley, can't remember her last name, but worked in administration. He fired her, and then when it was proven that she didn't do it, he didn't take her back. So, you know, sometimes, unfortunately, great people have great flaws.
Right.
And one of his was, I think, that he wanted white America to know that he could be tough on African Americans as well as whites. But there were plenty of people to be tough on rather than high-profile names, and to receive aggrandizement for yourself by making life more difficult. Now, in New York, the polls showed 72% that he should have minded his business.
Did it cross your mind to defy them and just run, knowing that you had the support of the state?
I was actually planning on doing that.
Right.
But there was, between January 10th of 2010 and March the 3rd of 2010, I was accused of doing 7 different things that were improper or illegal when I lived 55 and a half years before then and wasn't accused of anything. So I think there was a direct, coordinated attempt to derail my run for re-election. When I told my former wife that I wasn't running for re-election, she said, "Oh my God, why?" And I said, "Because if I run, I'm going to be indicted." And she said, "For what?" And I said, "I haven't the slightest idea." I think it was that kind of thing. And I think as people historically have gone back and looked at these allegations compared to the things that they're getting people for now, you can see that there is a fake news aspect to it. And listen, President Trump has earned a lot of the acrimony that he receives. But at times, because I've been through it, I can see how he's in a position now where in certain quarters you can say anything about him and people will believe it. And people do. Now, a lot of what's said about him is true, but I'm just saying I can see why he came up with the term fake news, because there's a lot of it from time to time. And it happens to a lot of people.
Do you regret not running for re-election at this time?
No, I think that Governor Cuomo was able to come in. He had to do one more tough budget with the legislature, and then I think people were able to move on. It got a lot quieter. It got a lot more cooperative, and he's made some great strides. $15 an hour wages, paid family leave, Tier 6 to the pension plan, same-sex marriage, an economic development plan. Now that the state has a little money, that can be executed. I think that I think I have a legacy is that it was a tough job. Whoever was there at that time probably would not have been reelected, but if the wrong person was there, we would have all suffered immensely.
Wow. Now, I've got some quotes that you had put out. Let's fast forward to the gubernatorial election right now. You recently you were quoted in describing gubernatorial candidate Cynthia Nixon by saying, now that you've converted to Catholicism, why do you have to be the Pope? And you also quoted as saying, people think that because you have fame, you can run for things. Having said these things, what's your take on Nixon's candidacy?
Exactly that. So her response to that is, oh, women have had to wait in the back of the line all the time, and I'm just not waiting anymore. But there's a line of women, and what makes her better than them? Why couldn't Kirsten Gillibrand be the governor? I'm sure she's comparing her knowledge of government to
an experience,
an experience is really like comparing 0 to infinity. And Kathy Hochul, the current lieutenant governor, she's been a city clerk, she's been a Congress member, she's traveled all over the state. She's another candidate. We have 2 African-American women running for Attorney General, Tisha James
Alicia Eve.
And Alicia Eve. Why couldn't they be governor? And there's a third woman in the race, Zephyr Teachout. Maybe she's a possibility. We have people at the congressional level. We have a minority leader in the Senate, Andrea Stewart Cousins. She could be governor. So she explained about the line of men. I hear that. Women have had to wait behind men. Why can't she wait behind some women who are more qualified, know more about government, and would have done their initial campaign speech in front of an audience and not on film, which is the only place she seems to be effective.
Well, somehow she found Brownsville in that process, which someplace she's never been before. But then also Nixon was quoted as saying blacks should be the first to get licensed for marijuana dispensers as a form of reparations. How would you characterize that kind of comment?
Overreaching. You know, trying, and here I think, sincerely, she's trying to let the black community know that she understands what I talked about before, the lack of businesses going to the community. But, you know, couldn't you find something a little more agreeable than the licenses for marijuana?
Is that
what about the licenses at LaGuardia Airport? They're rebuilding the whole place. You know, what about the investment banking municipal relationships? What about the fact that we are still in, we're going to expand the 2nd Avenue subway. They're going to need a lot of developers and contractors from 96th Street all the way up to 125th Street. Why would she pick marijuana and the licenses should go to African Americans?
Would you attribute that to her pandering, quite frankly, to the stereotype, or that was a legitimate idea with some serious concern that she wants to help the black community?
I don't think she meant any harm. I think it shows serious naivete.
Got you. I want to jump into the housing crisis here right now. And as one of the reports that we have, and I'm looking at the feedback from it, we feel that's going underreported is the housing crisis with evictions and homelessness on the rise. The New York Times ran a brilliant multi-part series on the topic 2 months ago. They actually reported that regulations and their enforcement to protect tenants have been weakened by landlords and the real estate lobby, and that people are being pushed out of their neighborhood and homes. This was actually brought out of one of our focus groups, you know, based on the questions we should ask. Your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think we have a tremendous homeless problem in the city. I think there's a lot of mismanagement when it comes to that. We are, our shelters aren't being organized correctly. I think, as you know, there's been corruption and dishonesty in the way the New York City Housing Authority deals with tenants there. And I think that the city is going to spend billions of dollars over the next 5 years to decrease the homeless population by 10%. That's just not going to be an answer. We're going to, one of the reasons that we have an increase in the homeless problem is probably an answer you probably haven't heard, Tony. I think we're losing jobs. When people don't have jobs, they become homeless.
Right.
And there was 17 Republican candidates that ran for president in 2016. There were 5 Democrats who ran. 22 candidates, and you all should go back, and particularly with your film crew here, and look at all the debates. Not once did anyone talk about the shrinking workforce due to artificial intelligence. You can call your bank, you can go through a toll, you can do a lot of things now and never even see or hear another human being. And there's a prediction that we'll lose $10 million jobs in the next 15 years to technology, to the same way we lost a lot of blue-collar jobs many years ago due to automation. Now, technology is great, and the power of invention and the expansion of knowledge and the capacity to make things easier for the population is not something we should ever try to thwart. But we're going to have to start thinking about what society we're going to be in when fewer jobs are available. So, for instance, should we have a 4-day work week? It kind of seems when you have a family, it's like you need 3 days in the weekend because you spend one day taking your kids to all these different activities.
Right.
Maybe we should have a minimum salary that we would give to anyone that isn't working, with the understanding that maybe they would participate in some volunteerism to make sure that they're doing something while they receive the money, and therefore that if jobs become available, they'll be employable, because when people are unemployed for a period of time, they become unemployable. But I think that is where you're seeing homelessness popping up all over the place, and you'll be shocked who's in shelters that used to be working and used to be working not in low-wage jobs, but in middle-class jobs. And I think that's a part of the problem that needs to be discussed.
Now, do you think that the real estate, I'm sorry, the real estate lobby, Airbnb, all those are contributing factors to folks being homeless as well?
Well, Airbnb, I think, is an issue of just the property values, because what's really happening is that people are able to make money on property that they don't always entirely own. And then that becomes a problem for the real estate community, and it becomes a problem for the hotels, obviously, because no one's going to use them anymore. And, you know, regulation has to be put there, because there are a lot of accidents and problems and abuses that go on with the Airbnb process. But I don't think I would cite it as one of the ignition tools of homelessness.
Got it. In your mind, Governor, is Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio, as well as the legislature, are they doing enough to address these kind of issues?
I think one of the reasons that we never discussed artificial intelligence with respect to homelessness and to employment is that for some reason, when elected officials are in a quagmire, when they're in a situation they can't figure out, the best message they can send, according to former President Woodrow Wilson, is that you don't always have to legislate, you can publicize. I think if more people talked about this, if more people were working on it, if more of our academic institutions were trying plans. I was interviewed by a business school student at Columbia about building new housing facilities on Long Island, and how what they're concentrating on because of the gang activity is building places to send the kids to after school between those vital hours of 3 and 7 o'clock, when there's the greatest teenage pregnancy, the greatest drug trafficking, the greatest suicide rate, the greatest gang activity and murders among young people, because there's no supervising agent. If we had programs for them to be in and let them do their homework then, instead of sending homework home for the parents to do, which is what goes on in schools now, I think it would altogether be a much better solution. In other words, I don't have the answer.
Right.
But I think we could find the answer if we paid more attention to it. You know, every time we have felt overwhelmed by anyone else in this country, we find an answer. In 1957, when the Sputnik spaceship went up, and all the Americans were just beleaguered and angered and frustrated because the Russians beat us to that, we put a space satellite up 6 months later and got to the moon in 1969, and the Russians have never been to the moon. So what I'm saying is, it's the challenge, not the answers. The challenge creates the answers, but I don't hear legislators or executives issuing the challenge to education communities, to the business communities, to the faith-based communities, and to the advocacy communities, people like yourself, to bring their ideas in. And so what we are doing is fulfilling the definition of Dr. Jonas Salk's view of insanity, doing things over and over again and failing, but expecting a different result.
Interesting. I want to follow up the previous question too. Now, being a Harlem resident, and with gentrification changing, I'm actually the poster child of gentrification in Brooklyn. My family and I, we were actually forced to live in an abandoned building because of gentrification.
Wow.
With that being said, the changing of the complexion of even your neighborhood where you lived, do you think the opportunities for Black and Latinos to reach your heights of political status, is that still something that can happen, or is it's a done deal?
Well, when they drew the congressional lines in 2012, I implored my colleagues, I was already out of office, that they draw the Harlem Black community into Co-op City with the African Americans there, and then into Mount Vernon, which is 70% African American. That would have kept an African American congressman. Both Congressman Rangel struggled to get reelected in 2012 and 2014. And finally, the candidate from this area, Assemblyman Keith Wright, lost to the very capable Assemblyman Adriano Espaillat in 2016. Well, in the congressional district, 57% of the people in the congressional district are Hispanic, mostly Dominican. 26% were Black, and 15 to 17% were white. So, you know, sometimes you have to change with the times.
Right.
And I thought that the Black community in Harlem reminded me of the whites who were in Washington Heights as it was becoming Dominican. The people don't mean any malice. They just tend to vote for people who look like them.
Right.
And everybody's done it. So there's no need to point fingers at anyone. And it's great to say it should be the best candidate. But the white representatives were never able to represent our communities the way people from our community did. Now, I think white candidates could do it now because we're living in a much more global world. But you know, old habits don't die, and people do tend to vote for people who seem familiar to them. So I think that the path to the executive mansion would be far more difficult if it were to occur.
So 2 more questions, and we're going to let you go. First question. How important is it that the governor of the state of New York has a really good relationship with the mayor of the city of New York, in light of what we're seeing between both Governor Cuomo and de Blasio right now?
I think where there's a good relationship, it augurs well for both sides.
Right.
If they're fighting over whose money is not in the MTA, or they're fighting over, as they have over the housing authority, and you know, who has more power in different places. What's interesting about this struggle is that usually the mayor of New York wins. New York is the major industry for news reporting. Washington, D.C. is second. Albany does not exist in that equation. So a governor, you know, I'll never forget, there was the Prince of Denmark came to New York. And I could have met him in New York City, and some staff member of mine had me meet him in Albany. There were like 6 press people there. And they're looking at me like, why did you bring us all the way up here? You know?
Oh, wow.
And that's just how it is. But Governor Cuomo, I think because of some, you know, poor judgment at times that's going on in the city administration, has been able to get himself into the housing issue and even into issues regarding the MTA very effectively, as no governor has done before. But I think that generally speaking, it's better when the governors get along.
Last question. Have we gotten to a point where we can handle what we call corruption in Albany, or is that still a major issue?
Well, you have people working in state government. They're around a lot of money. They're overly impressed by it. I think at this point, and when you talk about, we started this conversation talking about the Gang of Four.
Right.
Percy Sutton was an assemblyman in Albany who became borough president of Manhattan. David Dinkins was an assemblyman in Albany who eventually became mayor of the city of New York. Charlie Rangel was an assemblyman in Albany, you know, representing Harlem, all of them,
right,
who then became the Congress member. And Basil Patterson was a state senator who became Secretary of State in New York and deputy mayor. So they were the best and brightest of their time. They were in the assembly. When you pay people $79,500 a year, your best and your brightest are going to investment banks. They're going to be entrepreneurs. They're going to the higher echelons of education or healthcare delivery. They're going to start their own businesses. That's what a young Basil, a young David and Percy and Charlie would be doing now. And what we have in politics is, I think, a diminished caliber of legislators. People who, frankly, lack ability, and not all of them, but also, in many respects, lack the character. I mean, what appalls me is some of the people who've gotten picked up were accused of taking a $10,000 bribe, and you go to jail for it. Tony, let me tell you, when you hear that I took $10,000 from someone, that's a vicious lie. When you hear that I took $10 million from someone, it's probably a lie, but if I did, at least I could pay for my lawyer.
Finally, what would you like people to say and remember about your tenure as governor of the state of New York?
I think that I'm happy if people know that I cut about $40 billion of debt out of the state that had been piling up from previous governors who walk around acting like princes, but they were all parties to a improper use of gubernatorial authority in a coalition with the legislature to create this huge debt that we have in the state, even to this point. And because we had such a debt, when we ran deficits of over $20 billion in 2009 and over $10 billion in 2010 and 2011, in the end, we were saddled with a great problem, or our state would have been in an egregious financial state, as what happened in California, in Illinois, where they have $250 billion of pension debt, and in the state of Arizona, who was the last state to go into default in 1929 and is close to going there now. So I think that it's not as much what I wasn't able to accomplish as much as no one could have accomplished that some of what we've been able to accomplish in the last few years had not someone taken the action and taken the hit for that. I think when I first came out, I wasn't comfortable with that feeling. Now I'm honored that I was that person.
Governor, thank you so much.
Proud of all the time that I was there. You sure you don't have any more questions?
No, I got them all in. Thank you so much for your time, Governor. We really appreciate it.
Well, as usual, it's great to talk to you, Tony.
Thank you. Governor David Paterson. So there you have it. Here at the Morning Stretch, we brought you another first, the first African-American and legally blind governor in New York State history. Governor Paterson gave us the insights on how some of these decisions are made that affect you and I. You heard him answer some of the most very difficult questions I asked, like what happened when Governor Spitzer decided to resign? Why didn't he run for re-election? You also heard him talk about how he backed President Obama and how Obama didn't back him. You also heard about how the media has so much influence, and yes, there is such a thing as fake news, and how, unfortunately for Governor Paterson, it swallowed up his administration. You also heard, that's right, about the double standard he faces as an African-American governor and how people are so willing to believe anything, including fake news, if it's an African-American in office. So how does this affect you and I? You have a candidate for governor who's pandering to stereotypes for African-Americans by advocating putting in more drugs into your community, marijuana dispensaries, rather than implementing or exploring some of these innovative ideas Governor Paterson put forth, including pushing for training for people displaced by artificial intelligence. Hey, by making sure government is giving out contracts fairly by the value of the contracts and not simply by the number of them. So once again, we here at the Morning Stretch are trying to provide you with information that can better guide you and your decision making in determining who should sit in these offices and make those decisions that affect your lives daily. But you got to get up, you got to get out and do something. And that something is, you got to vote.